Okay. Hi, Dr. Posey. Good afternoon. Okay, well, here we go. This is my wonderful behaviorism poplet that I made. So, we will just start on the left and work left to right. I need to zoom in just a little. Okay. Oh, if we start over here on the left, we have behaviorism. That is the idea that human and animal behavior can be explained and altered by conditioning. And so the purposes of the reading were to talk about the two different types of conditioning this week, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So I'm going to start with classical conditioning first. Classical conditioning is used for with automatic or reflexive responses, which are naturally occurring responses. So things that you cannot consciously do, such as your pupils dilating, your heart rate speeding up, etc. Things that you cannot consciously control. So, in order for classical conditioning to work, you need a neutral stimulus, which can be anything, and you need an unconditional stimulus. An example of that would be like a light. If you were going to shine a light in your eye to make your pupils contract, that would be an example of an unconditional stimulus. So, a neutral stimulus is something that doesn't elicit any response, any physical response or behavioral, and an unconditional stimulus is something that does elicit a response, a subconscious response, and a reliable response that happens almost every time reliably. So when we put together our neutral stimulus and our unconditional stimulus, we get a conditional stimulus. And that conditional stimulus elicits a conditional response in the person. And so that conditional response is a response that occurs as a result of your unconditional stimulus and your conditional stimulus being associated with one another for long periods of time. A little bit later on, I'm going to talk about Pavlov and his dog, so that's where that example will come in. And then a conditional response in human reaction, it can occur even if the conditional stimulus is presented alone. So you don't have to any longer have the unconditional stimulus existing. You'll see later on, Pavlov, at the end of his experiment, that dog began to salivate when it heard the bell ring, regardless or not of whether it was going to be fed after the fact. Okay, so we'll move on. We're going to talk a little bit about Pavlov now. So he's famous for his experiment with a dog. What he did is he conditioned a dog to salivate. So he took a bell, some meat powder. His bell was his neutral stimulus because that bell didn't elicit any physical response. The meat powder is the unconditional stimulus because the dog always starts salivating when it smells or eats meat powder. And then its unconditioned response is the salivating. So the salivating is the unconditioned response in the beginning because all we have as a stimulus is the meat powder. So then after he does these experiments, he rings the bell, gives the dog some meat. Rings the bell, gives the dog some meat. Rings the bell, gives the dog some meat. So that later on, by the end of this experiment, the dog is salivating every time it hears the bell ring, regardless or not it's going to be fed. So that unconditioned response becomes a conditional response. Okay, now we'll move on to operant conditioning. And operant conditioning, we have a lot more going on over here. So we will start with our people. First, we have B.F. Skinner. He is famous for this experiment with pigeons. They call them the Skinner boxes. He put pigeons in a box. When they pushed a button, they received a reward. and they do this under the idea that when you get a positive response, that behavior will occur more often. And when you do an inappropriate behavior and you get a negative response, that behavior will occur less often. So the result of his pigeon experiment, where he was able to develop the theory that's called chaining, which is what we saw in the video we watched about the dog in New Zealand that learned how to drive. They used operant conditioning to train a dog how to drive, and so they started by teaching the dog, okay, you have to get in the car. Then they taught the dog, you know, how to start the car, how to put it into gear, and how to push on the gas. So they trained the dog how to do these things one step at a time, and after it had learned the one thing, they moved on to the next step, and so on and so forth, and that's called chaining. And so all of this rests on the idea that behavior is a result of your consequences. Okay, now we'll move on to E.L. Thorndike. He's famous for the law of effect, which is the idea that same idea, right? Behavior is a result of consequences. So responses that produce a positive effect are more likely to reoccur. And he showed this with his experiment with a cat in a puzzle box. So he constructed a box with a kind of trap door of sorts, and he put a cat inside with a piece of like cooked fish outside. The cat sees the cooked fish, and all of a sudden that is its incentive to figure out how to escape from the box. So each time he timed the cat and found out how long it took the cat to escape. Then put the cat back in the box, did it all over again. So that piece of fish being set out there on the side is the cat's incentive to try and escape from the box. So he's going to escape successfully more frequently now that there's an incentive to do so. Okay, so there's a few ways to reinforce behaviors. You could have reinforcement and punishment. So reinforcement is the idea that you want to increase the frequency of the behaviors. That's the goal behind reinforcement. And then punishment, the idea is to decrease the frequency of a behavior. There can be both positive and negative kinds of reinforcement and positive and negative kinds of punishment. So a lot of people think that positive matches with reinforcement because positive and negative goes with punishment, but that's not the case. There could be negative reinforcement and there can be positive punishment. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So positive and negative refers to the stimulus. So you're either going to be adding a stimulus to the environment or taking a stimulus away. And that stimulus can be a wanted stimulus or an unwanted stimulus. So, for example, positive reinforcement. The idea of positive reinforcement would be adding a wanted stimulus to a situation in order to increase the frequency of a behavior. So, for example, I studied really hard for my test. I got an A, and as a result, my parents took me out for ice cream. My wanted stimulus is the ice cream. It's a positive situation, so we're adding the ice cream into the situation because we want to increase the frequency of me getting A's on my tests. Negative reinforcement is the removal of a negative stimulus to increase the frequency of a behavior. So, for example, if I studied really hard on my test, but I didn't do very well because my parents were watching TV all night and it was distracting and I couldn't focus, and my parents wanted me to do better on my test next time, they would turn off the TV. They would stop watching the TV while I'm studying in order to help me do better on my test. So they're removing the negative stimulus. The unwanted stimulus is the distraction. So they're removing that from the situation in order to increase the probability that I'm going to get a better score on my test. Then we'll talk about positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment would be adding an unwanted or an adverse stimuli in order to decrease the frequency of a behavior. So if I got in trouble with my parents, for whatever, I was back talking, and they yelled at me, that would be a positive punishment because they're adding that yelling to the scenario. That's a negative stimulus, and they're trying to decrease that behavior. As far as the negative punishment goes, you are removing a wanted stimulus from the situation in order to decrease the frequency of a behavior. So a negative punishment would be if I slammed the door in my bedroom so my dad came by and took the door off its hinges. I've lost the privilege of having a door. So because they want to decrease the behavior of me slamming my bedroom door, they removed the door from its hinges, and that door is a privilege. So they're removing a wanted stimulus. Okay. Whew. Time to move on to methods of, like, ways to deliver stimuli when we are doing conditioning. So there are a couple different ways. You can deliver stimuli in ratios or in intervals, and for both of those, they could be fixed or they could be variable. So for the fixed ratio, that would be giving a reward or a stimulus, food, etc., after a specific unchanging number of correct responses. So if you're trying to encourage a specific behavior, you're going to reward that stimulus after I do that appropriate behavior a fixed number of times. That number of times is never going to change. So if it's set at 10, it's always going to be 10. And then quite the opposite for the variable ratio. It's given after a number of correct responses that changes over time. So the first time, if I did something correctly 10 times in a row, okay, I get it after the 10th time. Next round, I'd get it after the 4th time. Next round, I'd get it after the 3rd time, etc. Fixed intervals are very similar to the fixed ratio, only instead of relying on the number of times you exhibit the correct behavior, it's fixed on a specific time period, and it never changes. So, say I'll get a positive stimuli once a week for doing my job. Once a week. Every week. It's never going to change because it's in regards to time, not how much work I get done. So it's going to be once a week, every week for indefinitely. And then the opposite with variable interval. Same thing. I could get one positive stimulus per week on average, but it wouldn't be the same every week. So one week I could have 1, next week I could have 0, the next week I could have 2, etc. It's changing every time. It's variable. Now, it is proved that the ratios are more effective than the intervals, because if you're rewarding someone based on how much work they do, they're more likely to work hard. If you reward someone based on time and an interval, they're not likely to work as hard in that time interval because they're going to be paid the same amount every time regardless of how much work they do. Okay, let's see. I think that about does it for my graphic organizer. Here we are. We're zoomed back out. Zoomed back out again so we can look all pretty. And I think that's it. Okay. Thanks. Have a good day. Bye.